We hope you had a nice lunch break and perhaps some time chatting and connecting with other conference guests. Our next session is titled Equity on Campus, Navigating the Impact of the Supreme Court's Affirmative Action Decision in Higher Education. And indeed, higher education has seen the most immediate and profound implications of this ruling. Our distinguished panel of private and public university and community college experts will dissect the ruling's impact on admissions policies, campus diversity, and the broader landscape of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts within higher education. Our moderator this afternoon is labor and employment attorney Travis Kearbey, managing partner of Quarles Brady LLP. Travis advises clients on strategies for mitigating legal risk while pursuing DEI efforts or progress, and represents clients in an array of industries, including higher education. Joining Travis are our higher ed expert panelists, Trent Ball, Senior Director of Postsecondary Equity and Attainment System for the Missouri College Access Network. Yeah, Trent. You have a witness. Dr. DeAndre Braddix, who is the Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at St. Louis Community College. Dr. Algerian Hart, who is the Assistant to the President for Inclusive Engagement at Missouri State University. And finally, Dr. St. Rice Jr., Assistant Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Director of Faculty, Staff, and Community Engagement at Washington University in St. Louis. Let us give them all a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Vincent. It's an honor to be here and to be a part of the 9th Annual DEI Conference at Webster University and to take part in this important conversation. As Vincent noted, I'm an attorney, and so my work around this topic of navigating the evolving legal landscape as it relates to affirmative action and race-conscious or race-informed decisions in not only higher ed, but the workplace really focuses on advice and compliance and trying to develop strategies to equip professionals like those who appear on the stage with me as they carry out the work of making DEI progress and doing it in an ever more complicated environment with more and more obstacles that have arisen, especially since June of 2023. So I'll set the stage. I'm sure you all are familiar with the SFFA decision from the U.S. Supreme Court in June of last year. But to recap it quickly, the case was brought against both private and public institutions, Harvard College and the University of North Carolina. And the legal theory was simply that each had violated federal law as it relates to discrimination by considering race in admissions practices. Of course, Harvard is a private institution, so the constitutional theories under the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution were not available against Harvard, but it is a recipient of federal funds. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in a footnote, said essentially Title VI, which prohibits discrimination on a number of bases, including race, for recipients of federal funding, would be analyzed in the same way that the Equal Protection Clause is analyzed against public institutions. And with that footnote, wrapped both private and public higher education institutions into the same analysis, reaching the same conclusion. So with that, a lot of dominoes started to fall. And now, not only do private and public institutions have to grapple with how to pursue DEI progress with the obstacles of the way the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted federal anti-discrimination law, but also how that law is being pursued in terms of expanding its reach into other areas such as employment law and post-secondary, secondary education, elementary education even, at the state level. So I, as I mentioned a moment ago, am focused mostly on advice and providing counsel, But the gentlemen sitting with me are the ones that are actually doing the work and are experts in the field. So I want to get to their thoughts very quickly. Just a quick disclaimer. We are going to be sharing our views from our professional experience and thought leadership, but nothing in this presentation should be mistaken for legal advice. We're not giving it today. But we will be talking about how thorny these issues are, and that, of course, arises from the changing legal landscape.
Excuse me, really quick. Can I ask you all to shift in, if possible, so that we can have room for guests who arrive without much disruption? Thank you.
Thanks, Vincent. So anyone who thinks that this development in the law is limited to higher education has not been paying attention. The state attorneys general have signed letters and sent them to CEOs for many Fortune 100 companies, essentially warning them against pursuing DEI in a way that those attorneys general would characterize as utilizing race quotas or race-based preferences in a wide variety of different business decisions, everything from hiring to termination and promotion decisions, and even in relatively minor benefit allocation decisions, such as what are your standards for getting into the gifted program in second grade, literally. Is a topic that is being pursued at the state level in the name of the SFFA holding. And it's essentially the theory that this principle articulated by the U.S. Supreme Court has application under state anti-discrimination law as well. And so everyone's on notice, according to those who are pursuing that interpretation of the case, that their decisions may be at risk if they're using race quotas or race-based preferences in carrying out those decisions. So it's been a little over 6-7 months since the decision came out, and I'd just like to start our panel discussion by hearing from these professionals, both the private and public space, what's changed. So I'm gonna start with you, Dr. Hart, because you're from my alma mater, Missouri State. Can you share with us one thing that you've observed changing in the way that DEI progress is pursued since June 2023?
So just one thing.
One
Okay,
thing.
Okay, this is such a serious audience. I figured I'd try to see if I can make them laugh, but it didn't work, but that's okay. So I think, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, the one thing is the individuals who have been very strong advocates, particularly I'm going to talk about in higher ed leadership roles that maybe have provided resources, have hired individuals who have been seminal to creating pathways of access for those who maybe haven't historically had the opportunity to advance through a higher education experience. They have been at a pause. And I like to use a term, thermostat leadership. And so the temperature has been turned way down. And so those individuals who historically have been advocates, who have historically rather in front or even behind the scenes with being very instrumental in assisting individuals like this stage to do the work that's necessary and get the resources to those that have the talent to be able to create spaces of access, they're kind of, I don't want to say missing, but in some spaces they are less available. And that has really certainly created a space of, I don't want to use the term concern, but really a space of individuals who maybe have been kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out to be 100% out. Individuals who are 100% in now are vulnerable because those protections from those who are in leadership roles who can sit in a board of governors meetings or a board of regents meeting or administrative council and say, hey, we are going to do these things and you are going to lead. Now that conversation is not taking place. And so I say that specifically because in Southwest Missouri, we know is a little bit different than this part of the state. And I will let that, leave that to your imagination. But I think it's very significant in terms of our institution, One, in some of the relationships that are significant to our funding, how close Jefferson City is to us, and how frequently individuals come and visit our campus that maybe historically have kind of had a closed mouth, now feel very open and emboldened to express their opinions and thoughts in terms of the direction of our institution. So that is, maybe 15 things in one, but they're all connected.
Oh, that's very insightful. Thank you. And I'd like to hear from you too, Dr. Rice. What's changed from your perspective?
And I agree with Dr. Hart. One of the things that I'm noticing is where once before the ruling, we kind of looked at DEI work from a lot of different perspectives. And so now when we approach this work, it's a more concentrated and clear communication of what this work looks like. It seemed like everyone wanted to do it and be involved in some shape, form, or fashion. But now academies are looking and saying, okay, how do we clearly define language? What is our mechanism for developing training? What's the rationale behind it? And we're really taking a more evidence-based approach on how the work is being done. And that evidence-based approach, not that it wasn't before, but very intentionally making sure that it's tied to the strategic initiatives, and anything that's not tied to it is being challenged. And so having those hard conversations, because it's also related to resources, right? When you start talking about financial resources, you're talking about also human capital, and you're talking about change management. You have to think about, okay, what is the outcome? Where are we trying to go with this work? And so those spaces that were not doing it very well, or just kind of loosely doing it, we're starting to see them being shut down, and we're starting to see those who are taking the time to be very intentional about the work, really looking at the data. We're starting to see them starting to get some traction, even in the midst of all the things that we're seeing going on right now at WashU. Our Institute for Equity, which is our training branch, very intentional about a seven session training that really starts off with something as simple as what's shared language for DEI, so that Academy can have a shared language and we build from that space. So I'll pass it from there. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm hearing more careful approach to the way words are chosen, perhaps a more cautious attitude among those who might have previously been louder in their support. Those are, I think, really clear, observable changes. Let's shift down to Trent Ball. Oh, no. Let's hear from you, Dr. Braddix.
Yeah, thank you. So I feel the need to contextualize this conversation just a little bit more, because you had the SCOTUS decision, but you also had 5 bills last legislative session targeting DEI in our state. And so even before the SCOTUS decision, we were already mindful at St. Louis Community College of the temperature, I'll say, in Jeff City as it relates to DEI. And so for quite some time, we've been very cognizant about operating with great intentionality, so letting the data inform the work that we're doing, but also thinking about how we highlight the objectives that we're seeking to achieve through our work, as opposed to sometimes using the buzzwords that unfortunately have a lot of negative connotation now based on the way that it's being presented in the media and also through our legislators. And so it's really important that we, as much as possible, operate with that intentionality, where we really think, what is our goal here with the work that we're doing, and how do we best achieve that goal? And the more we can tie that to data, which has been said, the more we can connect that to institutional values, the safer we feel that we are in terms of validating that work and justifying it.
Thank you. And what I hear in your response, I think, is when you say being intentional about what you are going for, what your goals are, and not limiting it perhaps to some more narrow concepts that are often associated or thought of when people use the term diversity, equity, inclusion. Am I hearing this right, that you're thinking be more intentional about broadening the scope of what the goals are?
Absolutely. So, but I'll give a more specific example. So we have a program at St. Louis Community College called DEI 101, where we work with faculty, we get in front of their classes, and we present information as it relates to DEI connected to the field of study. So for instance, nursing, I'll pick on them. What we're doing is we're looking at the issues that a nurse may encounter in the workforce as it relates to issues connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then we're tying that to employer expectations as it relates to diversity and inclusion awareness and competencies using the National Association for Colleges and Employers, NACE, which has 8 career readiness competencies, of which you have teamwork, you have collaboration, you have communication, and you have diversity and inclusion. And so what we're doing is we're taking away that kind of moral conviction that for so long we have focused on, and I understand it, I do, but really trying to tie it to some of the other factors, accrediting bodies, and the fact that they want to see diversity and inclusion efforts at our institutions. Employers want their prospective employees to be prepared with those competencies before they would hire them. And so being able to point to the why and moving it away from what is unfortunately viewed many times as trying to indoctrinate people to change their thinking and their value systems. I don't need to change your value system. I need to equip you with the skills that you need to navigate this world that is diverse, and you're going to encounter people that have different beliefs and experiences than you, and it doesn't hurt anybody to understand those experiences and to support people where you can.
I think that's powerful, and certainly moves it in a positive direction rather than having a negative reaction to the evolution. And Trent Ball, what are your thoughts on what you've seen change since the decision?
Well, mine is quick and dirty. I've seen the idea across the state that people are running from something rather than regaining control of the narrative itself. And so what has happened is, I always say that no one breaks into an empty house. If it wasn't working, we'd be under attack. So I think it's part of a larger picture, and this is my own, this is not a Mocan statement. This is a Trent statement. I believe that it's part of the movement to disrupt public education and privatize it. And so the Secretary of Education, Dr. Cardona, said DEI is now the boogeyman, and we've let it become the boogeyman. But I'm impressed by the people who are saying we're not going to do this. So we saw a letter a few days ago that went from the Attorney General to 3 public school districts, and Webster Grove said, don't the students deserve to see people that look like them helping them? We're forgetting the large part of the message. So I try to remind institutions and having conversations about your intentionality can't change. The fact that we have had progress can't change. Now, maybe we have to pivot a little bit. I'm okay with that. But we talked about this earlier. My biggest concern is who do we have doing the work defines the importance of the work. And I've seen 1/3 of the people I work with over the last 2 years leave the jobs. Some leave the state to go places where they felt safer to do the work. So what I've seen is people really wrestling with the idea of, can we really get the work done? And can we do it honestly and earnestly? And as the person in the audience, I'm sorry I didn't get your name earlier. You made a very good point. Be careful as we pivot that the students can still find us.
So those are really valuable insights and alarming observation that you're seeing so many professionals leave the state, leave this occupation because of the challenges that they experience in trying to carry out this work. One of the things that this group and I talked about in preparation for our presentation was how do those who are not working in the DEI space best support their colleagues who are doing this work? And your point, I think, provides a good segue into that topic, because if we are seeing diaspora of DEI professionals, perhaps geographically or just across the board, perhaps that's a cry for help from their colleagues to provide greater support and lift them up. What do you think you've observed that's effective in the way that you've worked with and collaborated with other departments in your institutions, whether it's HR or donor relations, advancement, perhaps it's legal? What's the best way for your colleagues to show up so that you're supported in your DEI work and able to actually make things happen? Dr. Rice, you want to start out?
So I come from a career path that focused on teamwork. I would tell people I wasn't born in higher ed. I've been in this space now about 12 years full time. But prior to that, I had a 20-year career in a space where you had to work as a team. And one of the things I noticed when I came into higher education was the silos and how oftentimes departments work alone. And even within those departments, individuals work alone. They could be in the same space. And so now I see this push that for the academy to exist and to get through this next wave of change, because what we consider to be normal, I don't believe is going to come back from the movement, from the pandemic all the way through what we're dealing with now, and even the shifts and changes within society when we're looking at the diversification of ethnicities and races and things of that nature. And so I see a need for those key spaces to really collaborate, to get an all-academy view of what the issue is. No longer can HR or our legal department or our academic affair department, no longer can we sit in our own spaces and actually just and make these decisions and think that these decisions are going to yield the benefits that we're looking for. I see more of a unified approach to get varying perspectives based off of our expertise and where we sit within the academy, to deal with things such as policy, to deal with things such as training needs, to look at issues such as data collection, those things that are critical for our survival and critical for our growth, and really having an impact that we hope to have. So that's one of the things I'm seeing happen, in particular in our school. We see more unification within the departments and how we talk, how we communicate, and before we make those decisions, going back to the evidence-based approach, we hear from the different stakeholders to make sure that we're seeing things right? And so if I go back to another career, you want to measure twice, cut once, and taking that approach. Right?
That's helpful. I'm curious, have any of you other gentlemen had really good experiences, collaborative experiences with your colleagues that you think help inform how to best engage with DEI as someone who's not in that profession to help move things forward?
Yeah, so I'll just share one thing that I think has been really invaluable is when working with other departments outside of DEI, that sponsorship really helps to highlight our work in a different way. And so I think about human resources. I do a lot of collaboration with human resources, and in some institutions, my department would be under human resources. Fortunately, it isn't, which means that I can kind of be an accountability check for HR and other departments as well. But I've been involved in a lot of mediations between supervisors and employees and staff-to-staff issues, and also doing conflict resolution training. So not things that you would typically assume or associate with DEI, but the beauty of that is it allows me to engage with people, okay, so they can get to know me on a different level. And then I think it opens their eyes to maybe what I could do in terms of coming to them and talking about a DEI topic. We can't overlook the misconceptions that are out there about DEI. So many people have reduced it to race and gender and think that even within race, we're really talking about one race and solely one race. And when we're talking about gender, we're exclusively talking about either women or those that are trans and non-binary, and it's so much broader than that. And so what I'm finding is it's not that there's necessarily people that are opposed to DEI and engaging in that work. They just don't see the connections between DEI and their work. And the more that I can interact with people, the better. And so it creates opportunities for invites that I never probably would have gotten otherwise. Also, I think that those other departments can really help us to kind of serve as a check on and balance on us. And so when we're talking about diversity recruiting, that can sound very different, or the intent there can sound very different to different people. And so whenever I'm able to reach out to my colleagues in HR to say, hey, I'm writing this up, can you give me your thoughts on this? They ask good questions of, what do you mean by this? Because if I'm asking this question, somebody else is going to ask this. Are you saying you want to be preferential towards, candidates of color that are diverse? what I want to do is ensure that we control for unconscious bias in the hiring process and that people with like credentials move through the process similarly and equitably. That's what I mean. And so they're able to give that feedback where I can go back to the drawing board to say, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, sometimes yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you, all right. So it's just a good opportunity for me to be able to ensure that what we're setting out to do, that we're using the right word choice and that we're framing things in a way that's accessible to everyone.
Terrific. Trent Ball, any thoughts from you on what works well?
Well, actually, I was thinking, conversation DeAndre had a few weeks ago. I think part of it is working together to provide that space to vent and understand and move forward. Because what's happened is people become siloed and afraid. We have to find those, and I have a really good friend in the room who taught me this. We need to stop discussing allies and talk about true partnerships. You asked earlier how you elevate that part. So when Vince reached out to me, I thought about who are the people that we can bring forward who are experts in this work, because what we think is it's not happening. It is happening. We have to get more people that are doing it to stand front and be seen doing it.
That's helpful. I'm going to come to you next, Dr. Hart, but I want to guide us toward a discussion about what many in both the legal community and the DEI community have decided perhaps are too risky to do, things that may have been pretty common in the past but have become seen as very risky in the wake of the SFFA decision. So the Harvard Business Review published an article last month called DEI is Under Attack. And it, I thought, provided a pretty good summary of some of the sort of top 3 or 4 DEI initiatives from the past that are now considered pretty risky. And those that it listed are hiring quotas, tiebreaker decision making. So the sort of the tagline of if you have 2 equally qualified candidates and one is a minority candidate and one is more privileged, go with the minority. The tiebreaker decision point of view. Characteristic exclusive roles like diversity internships. Law firms, very prominent law firms, have been sued in the last 6 months by the same activist groups that brought the case against Harvard and UNC for having clerkships for minority law students. And then the last would be tying compensation to diversity goals. So giving managers compensation or incentives that are tied to money relating to how well they perform under DEI metrics were the 4 sort of highest risk categories that the Harvard Business Review identified. I'm interested, Dr. Hart, what's your reaction to sort of compartmentalizing some of these higher risk activities that were once very commonplace, and what are some strategies that higher ed institutions and private employers can pursue outside of those high risk activities that still are aimed at the kind of progress that DEI is meant to try to achieve?
So, and don't forget loyalty oaths, right? How it can be manipulated and on both ends of the spectrum. So let us not forget that at the core of education is inquiry. And that is a space where it's about knowledge. And in order to sojourn through that path of obtaining knowledge, there has to be access. But also there has to be what we would call lessening the ignorance. On one end, ignorance not meaning that somebody doesn't have the capacity to understand or they're not very bright. It's ignorance meaning just don't know. So when we talk about universities and colleges and institutions of higher learning, you have to be very clear as to what is your brand and how is it that you are connecting access, inclusion, diversity, and equity to your brand. So many institutions are looking at things through the lens of, wait, let's get rid of language, and we're going to change the language. Well, one, and since we get to be transparent now, we're moving down that hot path. Remember I said thermostat leadership, right? So one, what has happened is the notion that we were doing things right anyway. I'm going to repeat that. The notion that we were doing things right anyway. So what many schools have done is you have entities on your campus. So we talk about the silos, whether it's a college, a school, a department. Have they been working collectively anyway? Or as Trent has said, many folks have been doing good work, but they haven't there wasn't a need to really go out and have to collaborate because everybody kind of wanted to do that or kind of thought that, well, that's a go-to person. But now we've come to the thought process that whether we want to disaggregate the data or not, because how we disaggregate the data is where we can find out where our shortcomings are. Now we're not allowed to disaggregate the data in the same ways that we were before. So what institutions are doing is trying to figure out how they can continue in the path where we see this. You hear enrollment cliff, you hear in terms of institutional choice and what is going to be a space where I'm seen. We want to talk about belonging, but it has to begin with I can see myself there because there are individuals who can see me. Because you're not always going to be at an institution where there's going to be people that look just like you. So what you have to do is be able to create a pathway that shines a light that says, here's a path and we got you. And so universities are at a point figuring out that we don't do that. So if we don't do that, how then do we move forward with trying to identify those that can help us do that? But if you do that, that means you're admitting that DEI matters. I'm not trying to be profound. I'm just trying to say these are the conversations that get very tricky. So when you sit in the boardrooms with administrative council or you're amongst your board of governors or regents, these conversations are being asked that, you know, Dr. St. Rice, you're the expert. Can you tell us? Because he represents all and everyone, right? Right? And so if that is the reality of where we are, then the question can be turned on the other side of the coin as to who's willing to support the questions that are being asked about access and who is being upfront and honest about their desire to increase that pathway that seems a little bit murky right now. I know I didn't answer it in a very traditional sense because there is some nuance that we have to address first.
No, fair point. And I'm curious, what is your reaction and what do you may have to add on to that, Dr. Rice?
I think one of those efforts that is too risky now is actually addressing the path that got us here in the first place. Is looking at the historical issues. And so now that conversation has become too risky to now we don't want to have it. We want to avoid it. We want to stay away from that. We don't want to deal with the issues of slavery. We don't want to deal with all those things that are the birth child of that period. And so, and where higher education was once a place where we can have conversations about anything and have dialogue about the most critical issues, now there's a limitation because it's too risky. As if having that conversation means that now we've come to a reality that exists. It's always existed. We sense it outside the ivory tower. We sense it. Those students who have limited access or historically have been excluded from having access into higher education, they bring it with them. So for me, the risk is being transparent about the reality of what is. So
I've got to break some myths here. This myth of enrollment cliff is just that. The cliff is full-time, part-time, full pay, partial pay, majority students. That's the cliff, the students that the institutions want. If you look at let's do whatever. Let's talk about the data. Okay, in 2015 was the first time in our country that the number of children entering kindergarten or majority Black, brown, or low-income communities. So that means in 2028, that's your freshman class. Are you prepared for them? Do they not deserve the opportunity to be in a space that they belong in? So in 2021 was when the high school numbers start changing. So don't think this was just some pop out of nowhere. This was an idea of, oh my God, look at these numbers, what are we gonna do about it? So if we keep doing it in the manner that we are doing it, we're gonna let students and faculty and staff know that you're not wanted here. We don't have a path for you here. But if you want to keep your doors open, institutions, you must figure out how to recruit those students, help those students matriculate, help them be successful, help them graduate, because your numbers are going down. So you have a population out there, so start talking about this cliff. The cliff isn't real. The students are there. The faculty and staff are there. Are we creating spaces that they can belong in and thrive in? Because I had to check myself and go, there was a time period where I thought that what was important was getting the student through the system, help them navigate that point. Now we have to get inside the system and break it.
So when I think about your question in regards to our work in DEI, I think about one of the bills that was proposed in the last legislative session that would prohibit DEI statements being part of the hiring process. And one institution, a very large institution in Missouri, even though that bill did not pass, they went ahead and said that they were no longer going to use DEI statements. And to that I say, what is the objective with the DEI statement? At St. Louis Community College, we're very fortunate to have 51% of our students are students of color. And so what we want to ensure is, as we're hiring individuals, is that they understand they're coming into a diverse environment and they're going to be working with a diverse population, and that they're not only comfortable with that, but that they understand our values in regards to supporting and enhancing that diversity. And so there are many times that we can look at what the bills are coming out of Jeff City and what they're focused on, and I use that to actually help inform my work. As we're doing the DEI 101s in classes, I think about one of the bills that would prohibit required DEI training. And it says that anything that includes anything that promotes collective guilt, identity activism, there's another one that I'm forgetting too, preferential treatment. And I make sure that everything I'm doing does not, and I mean it wouldn't, but does not help to kind of proliferate that misthinking. And so for me, it just keeps coming back to the intentionality. I don't think that we're in a space where we have the luxury of letting people leave spaces with question marks, because when we do that, they're going to fill those in. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be filled in with what they're hearing in the echo chambers, which isn't always the most supportive and really informed point of view as it relates to DEI and the importance of our work.
So are you looking for ways to communicate the DEI goals that your organization is pursuing that uses the language that sort of has been endorsed as permissible within the legal community? Is that part of the goal?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just trying to take control of that narrative. I mean, imagine being in a field, for those of you that aren't in DEI, where people are telling you what your field is, and there's no room for you to inform their point of view. We heard from, our lobbyists and the folks doing work in Jeff City. They don't want to have these conversations as much as we want to sit down and tell them about what we're doing. There is a thought, and unfortunately, some people are unwilling to move from that thought. I don't want to invite any headaches in my life, but I would not mind going to Jeff City to testify on behalf of DEI because I wouldn't do so from a place of moral conviction, even though I feel strongly about it. I would use the data to help support the work that we're doing. I would use the words that I hear from legislators against DEI against them. When we're very comfortable talking about anti-Semitism in higher education, as you all likely saw in Congress a couple months back. Well, but we also are hearing from people that, racism doesn't exist anymore. Well, how can both be true, And so if we're willing to acknowledge that anti-Semitism exists, which it does, can we not also agree that maybe Black and brown students, low-income students, haven't always been, treated the most equitably and always haven't had the greatest opportunity to be successful as their peers? I think that there's a world where all that can be true, because it is, and we're living in it.
I think that makes good sense. And going back to language choice, I don't remember which one of us said it, but in our conversations leading up to the panel, one of you made the point that you're observing that there are even title changes that are sort of sweeping the DEI market, that certain titles that used to be given out to DEI leaders have been modified in a way to avoid, I suppose, hot button type terms. Was that your comment, Trent?
Sorry about that. We were discussing the idea that if you're going to pivot, make sure people know what your work actually is. But also, we were talking about taking it higher. And it was a conversation we had. So you don't have a person for DEI. Well, why is this not now your dean of institutional effectiveness or mission enhancement or taking yourself to the policy level as you retitle me? So, because I think what's to our advantage is the fact that it hasn't been properly defined what it is. We have to get that narrative back and control it ourselves. So you can be in a space where you can work in marketing, human resources, different areas, bringing that lens with you, but from a point of institutional structure. So I'm okay with changing the title if you're going to keep the work together and make an identifiable title impacting the entire system. So I'm okay if I'm no longer, Dean of Multicultural Affairs, if I'm Dean of Institutional Effectiveness, and I can comment about everything going on at the institution versus just being kept over here.
Well, and someone else has already made this comment, I think, but to your point, because DEI was already complex and is becoming even more complicated now, and has a natural fit within many different departments within a typical organization, whether it's recruiting or donor relations, et cetera. Perhaps the elevated title is not just a clever way to avoid hot button terms, but also an appropriate descriptor of the elevated role. What are your thoughts?
Because representation matters, right? And in intentional development in terms of growing spaces and being creative and being innovative. Case in point, some of it is, and I feel like a broken record with this, lessening the ignorance, the things that we don't talk about, like in rural Southwest Missouri, there are rural black folks and black kids that have the same issues and concerns, although there's some, nuance that the rural white kids have. But we don't talk about that because we want to pick and choose what is defined as diversity. And that's what we talk about, lessening the ignorance. When we talk about Jefferson City, I'll be doggone if we don't talk about the value of autism. That's diversity. When we talk about our veterans, that's diversity. So we can just keep going on and on and on. Disability, all of those are connected to diversity. And so if we're really going to be honest about it, we have to look at it through the lens of, I'll go back to the brand. What is your institution really doing? There are the federal laws. I mean, you have to have access for individuals to be able to come into a building and get from A to B. That's compliance. But in terms of that true fabric of the DNA of inclusion, well, what does that look like? Because we spend so much time on the institutions, universities and colleges are always, just education as a whole, is looking for solutions. But sometimes when you look for solutions, you haven't accurately and effectively addressed the problem. And so if we can spend a little more time as to, we really don't do that very well. Why don't we do that very well? And along the way, when we get to a point, we don't have to have Band-Aids, because right now, changing language, changing and moving spaces over, it's like hide and seek. If you don't think individuals are going to say, oh, well, because you can see how legislation has shifted from what Florida first put out there to what Texas just went ahead and said, hey, we're going to do away with everything, to Oklahoma, to where Missouri, the first go around, it wasn't voted as a go-ahead. But trust me, they're recalibrating. And you're looking at just what happened in Idaho, what Idaho is trying to do. As of 24 to 48 hours ago, I was literally just speaking to a colleague who's a dean at a university in Idaho, and it's less than 48 hours. They have to figure out how to get rid of stuff, not pivot. There's no time to pivot. It's get rid of. What are you going to do? So if you can't find a space where there's this commonality and supportive community, that has an intellectual discussion base, but also can speak unto the those that they're supporting. What are we doing? And so we're not going to stop doing what we're doing, but we have to certainly make note that we're uplifting it, and we can put a spotlight on that value.
Great points. And, just picking up on your comments, and Dr. Braddix, you made this comment too, about how diversity means more than race and sex, essentially. In many different conversations, when people talk about DEI, they're reducing it to those two factors. And you mentioned veteran status, and it just occurred to me that, from a legal perspective, there are protected groups that are treated differently by anti-discrimination law than some. Our laws that address race discrimination protect all of us symmetrically, essentially, if they're read plainly, and that's what the Supreme Court essentially was saying. But that's not true of all of the anti-discrimination laws. Veteran protection is asymmetric. There is no protection of non-veteran status, right? So you can benefit explicitly some protected minority groups or a diverse background without giving rise to this kind of issue that has gotten some institutions in legal trouble. The same is true with respect to the disability community, right? There's no non-disabled or able-bodied protection under the law in the way that there is for those who suffer from disabilities. Dr. Braddix, I'm curious, have you done any work at St. Louis Community College that's designed to target some of those perhaps lesser thought of or not top of mind for some people, groups that are yet nonetheless part of the diversity community? They're very much a part of the diversity community, but sometimes they're even marginalized within the discussion.
Yeah, so actually when I arrived at St. Louis Community College in June of 22, one thing that I did was I reached out to all the different departments of the college that have a natural connection and synergy with diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of those being veteran services. And whenever the director got back with me, he asked me to help him understand how I saw the connection between DEI and veterans. And so I explained it, and he lit up as I was explaining it, and he said, "I agree with everything you've been saying." He's like, unfortunately, I haven't always felt that veterans have been seen as part of the DEI umbrella. We actually have 7 employee resource groups at the college that fall under DEI. One is employees with disabilities. We also have a veterans group, LGBTQ+, Asian American and Pacific Islander. We really, there's infinite possibilities for creating those groups, under DEI, but part of my budget goes to support the work in disability access to make sure that they're out there in the community able to do the good work that they need to do. Veterans, give them money for film series and other events to engage our veterans. It's really important that we talk broadly about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I will tell you, in terms of the newest legislation that's been proposed in our state, there's actually a carve-out for disabilities and veterans. And so when they say we're going to prohibit funding to DEI offices, except for those requirements as it relates to those two populations, it seems as though they're kind of getting wise to maybe some of the errors they've had in previous bills that they've proposed. But I think it's all the more important we have to continue helping people see the wide breadth of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and at its core, what we're talking about. With diversity, we want our institutions to reflect the diverse communities that we support, okay? With equity, we want fair access and opportunity. I don't care if that means that you're a person of color, if it's about your gender, your religion, or your political affiliation. You should have every right to be considered for positions and to advance within an organization and to be a successful student regardless of any identities you hold. And with inclusion, at the end of the day, we just want you to feel that sense of belonging and that sense of connection to our institution regardless of any of those identities. It's not preferential to any one population or group of people. If we do DEI right and operationalize it based on the principles that DEI stands for, who can argue against that? I want to be in classrooms where you have older students and younger students, veterans and non-veterans, Black and white students and Asian students and students that are international, students that are conservative and liberal. That's what we promote. I just got done rewriting our freedom of expression policies. I think it's really powerful that the person in DEI is rewriting those to align with state law that says that outdoor spaces at public institutions are traditional public forums for you to engage in free expression that is viewpoint neutral, meaning we will not come in and police what you're saying because we don't like it. And when I get those calls from people saying somebody's in the quad saying something we don't like, I tell them we have an institutional commitment to free expression. And sometimes that runs counter to our own personal value system, but that does not mean that that is not a value of the institution. That's where I think DEI can excel, and that's what I would say if I got in front of the legislature for testimony. So, yeah.
Good trial run there.
We shall make that happen.
Well done. And it's a great segue into the next point that I want to raise, which is we're sitting here on a university campus. You're all part of the education community. I'm not. I'm part of private practice, private business. And I'm wondering, and I'll go to you, Dr. Rice, what, if any, special role do you think that academia should be playing in advancing DEI progress relative to, perhaps the private industry, the private sector, and especially given the legal challenges that DEI faces in general?
So when I thought about this particular question, I looked back at 1977 because that's how long this affirmative action, that's kind of like the birth of it. University of California Regents and versus Bakke. And when we saw Justice Lewis Powell, one of the things he stated, and I quote, "Race is considered in a flexible program designed to achieve diversity, but it is only one factor weighted competitively against a number of other factors being relevant." And I think when we're looking at higher education and its influence, if we look at those other factors, what are those other disparaging factors that impact the students that land in our space, that come through our doors or don't get a chance to come to our doors? And so I know earlier we had Dr. Kelvin Adams, who was up on the stage and was the former superintendent of St. Louis City. Later we're going to have the superintendent for University City. When we talk about what academia can do, I think one of the things we could do is look at those disparities before they come, before we get here. How do we become an active part of change in our communities? How do we deal with the socioeconomic disparity that leads to poor academic achievement? How do we deal with the community influences that are there based off of the violence? And I'm talking specifically for the St. Louis region, since I'm here, the violence that we're dealing with. How do we deal with the lack of access to resources that some school districts have and some school districts don't, right? Because that's what's really impacting us when they get to our doors, right? That makes the difference between whether a student is going to be successful or not. Now, in high school, I was a first-generation college student. And in high school, academics wasn't high on my list. I did enough to stay on the football field and track and all the other things, right? But I had friends who, the honor society and all those things were critical for them. And they worked very hard only for both of us to end in college. And I found out that they also were in remedial classes. How is it that you are in honor societies, but when you test for college, you end up in the same space, right? Because we're not looking at the disparities that happen within particular school districts, and how does academia get outside of its wall, partner with the school systems, partner in the communities, and say, okay, yes, really deal with this issue so we can have prepared students no matter what school they go to. Not just, quote unquote elite schools that they find success, but we see generational change, generational wealth, we see impact no matter what college they go to. Because the whole purpose of that is to help them get to the next level of their own career path. So that's one of the things I believe the academia can do that's outside the norm,
That's really interesting. And so it's outreach. It's not waiting for students to come and show up, however they show up. It's going out and building the base of students who can show up and be successful. That's interesting. And Dr. Hart, I think you were making the point earlier about how, and I'll paraphrase the way I understood it, essentially the evolving legal landscape, I'll say, sort of has chilled the willingness of some people to speak openly in the way that they may have used to been comfortable doing so. But, you know, given the First Amendment protections that apply to scholarship and provide for academic freedom in these spaces, is there a role for scholarship to be the home for these candid discussions that private sector businesses perhaps don't have the liberty to take part in within academia?
Absolutely. As somebody that came through I should say that took his lumps coming through the faculty ranks, it is so seminal that research, service, and scholarship continues to evolve, especially in these challenging times. But it's funny to say in these challenging times, because times have always been challenging, right? But the thing and I'll speak at my institution, where we have, from day one, faculty inquiry has been about, hey, how does that impact us? We know we have academic freedoms that are protected, so where can we help? Rather it's the pedagogy in our design. Maybe we can go back and talk with Faculty Senate and really hone in on some areas that would benefit our institution as a whole. But you need to have a collective faculty identity that is allowed. And it's funny because saying that faculty are allowed is just kind of a strange statement, but in a space of safety amongst numbers and to pursue those scholarly. Because what we're doing is looking at the inclusive portal. And we know that inclusive portal is global, but we really focus in on our domestic issues. And I'll use Dr. Adams again, because I was at the speech when you kind of announced your administration. And the one thing you had talked about is mentorship matters. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of that, the faculty have just a tremendous opportunity to mentor in the classroom, outside of the classroom, and dare I say, setting the tone for which we continue to put a spotlight on valuing access, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so from that perspective, the things that individuals are trained to do, let them do. And make sure that they have the resources and support that when they produce that work, it's something that we're willing to take as administrators and say, hey, look at the benefits, not only to enhance our institutional brand and profile, but we're creating opportunity for those that really desire to be here.
Terrific. And I know, Mr. Ball, you're involved in training people who are going to go and work in these spaces. What is your perspective on what needs to be done to encourage the kind of scholarship that we're just discussing? What needs to be done? What incentives need to be there to encourage that kind of scholarship to take place?
Dr. Hart just mentioned it, but we have to step it up beyond the regular mentoring, and we have to be more sponsors. So we have to open up our door and opportunities to the people who are coming into the field to do the work. So for example, so often, because the people who are in power are in my age group, we talk about, oh, they got to serve their time, they got to take their lumps, so you put them through the same struggles that you went to for what purpose? You knew it was rough, so why would you repeat that foolishness? But instead, we want them to jump through these hoops. No, we need to provide structure, that they have access to other leaders, that they can see they can see themselves. So we had a meeting we were on WashU's campus, and it was called Professional Trajectory. Not a plan, let's talk broader than that. And the goal was to connect those young professionals to seasoned professionals to sponsor them, which means you have an opportunity, pass it on. You have an opportunity to go to attend this event, bring the young people with you to the event so they're comfortable going and they're connected within it. Or with your colleagues, it's the ability to say, I need to call DeAndre so I can vent right quick and make that time to do that. But what happens is we suffer and we pay the tax all the time. Because what we're really talking about is, in the faculty world, that's built into their world. It's not built into the world of the staff. So how do we build that same opportunity in? Because it's just like, I always say, it's just like public schools. When things get bad, you cut gym and art. When things get tight, you cut professional development and processing for your staff to move up. It's not another crowded room, I'm saying it again. The next person that sends me a 4-page job description to pay somebody $40,000, I'm gonna punch them in the neck. Because I think we're not investing in our young people, so they're not staying in the field. They don't see it as a profession. I asked point blank, how many people in this room chose higher education as their profession, and out of 30 people, 1 person raised their hand? So why have we not made the academy something people aspire to being a part of and representing in? And before I move on, I want Dr. Rice to explain something he taught me a long time ago. He doesn't call them institutions. Go ahead.
One of the reasons why I don't call higher education spaces institutions is because I talked about my prior career. In my prior career, I worked in the prison system. I was an administrator, and that was an institution, right? That was an institution. When I transitioned into higher education, I could not call it the same. So I started calling it academy, because when we think about the academy, and although some of the same issues exist in both, believe it or not, some people don't believe that, but the same existence, actually the pathways are similar, right? And so when you think about, real quick, when you think about the design of a college and the design of a prison, kind of close, right? As some parents, it's like, wait a minute, you had them 4 years and they just came back to lay it home, but that's my story. So, but the academy is a lot different.
Very good. Well, I know.
Mind if I just
Go,
quickly
sure.
jump? Yeah, I just want to say that I think it's extremely important that we remember that classrooms should be ideal spaces, not necessarily safe spaces. When I think of a safe space, I think of a place where you go to be affirmed and supported, a support group, especially if you've been the victim of any kind of trauma. That is not a classroom space. And unfortunately, we have some faculty whose hearts are very, very well intended in trying to support students. But what it means is we're stifling good, productive discourse that should be taking place in classes. If we can't talk about issues around bias and racism and systemic oppression in classroom spaces in which we allow people to have dissenting opinions, then how are we modeling, we're not modeling those behaviors for them when they leave those classroom spaces and try to go into the workforce. And what do you have now? You have people on 2 different sides of a political aisle that almost refuse to talk to each other at times. And what we do is we lean into our own ecosystems. And what would be so much better is if we really could create spaces where we can model that that you can have your opinion and I can have mine, but facts are facts. And you know what? And if we're in disagreement, let's look for peer-reviewed research to figure this out. That there's so much that can be had, so much positive impact, I think, as it relates to supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion, starts in a classroom setting. And the more that we can remember those are ideal spaces for tough conversations and not run from that, I think we're all the better off.
Excellent points. So I know we want to open this up for questions from the audience, including those who have joined us via video. If anyone has a question, there are mics on both sides of the seats, and I think Vincent will collect questions from online if any are posed.
Sure will, and I'll start with one online from Denise, and she says, Mr. Rice's comment on the subject of student preparedness is a difficult one. It requires a transparency and vulnerability that many are not willing to engage in, i.e., admission that, quote unquote, my honor status is different than yours or not up to par. How do you overcome that to even get to the next step?
So one of the things I believe is, and this is Saint speaking, I believe that partnership with higher education academies and our K through 12 academies help us to create the bridge in understanding what the expectations are, right? And so when we work with those schools that are not as resourced as other schools, and we bring in the assistance, the tutoring, when we bring in those resources that they may need to understand what does it mean to be successful in the next level of your education, because it's not is not like broken. There's a flow that happens here. It's an educational system, not just disjointed as we look at it. And so how do we meet with those administrators and say, okay, understand that if your students are going to come to our college, this is the level that we'll need them in. And not only this is the level, but these are the things we're willing to do to help your educators help prepare these students for success at the next level. It's a matter of partnership and collaboration. It's a matter of us coming together and looking at what are the barriers that's preventing us or preventing those students from being successful, and addressing those barriers oftentimes at a grassroots level, bringing in community partners, redirecting some of the resources that we've directed some to other places. Speaking of our legislators, redirecting those resources into those areas to deal with the deficiencies that we're dealing with. I don't know if anyone else
This would be for the whole panel. I'm confused. How is it that parents or people elected to school boards who have no educational certification degrees whatsoever can walk into a room and in a simple majority vote change the curriculum when you have principals and people who already have the degrees, much less state accreditation associations? And similarly, how on the state and federal level can legislators who perhaps have no educational degrees or certification whatsoever, how can they vote and change curriculum and educational practices when you have a Department of Education that supposedly is completely staffed with experts? The same thing for the Supreme Court. How can they make decisions when at the very least you would think you would go to your departments at the state or federal level and say, you're the experts, that's why we put you here, give us a recommendation. We shouldn't be approving something that doesn't have education certification. I was a former grade school principal. I couldn't have been a principal without a degree. And yet I would have parents come in, and it's not that parents can't come in. Yes, make recommendations that we take to the people. Legislatures, make recommendations. I don't understand how you can completely bypass the departments at the state, federal, and other levels, and just basically say, here's the way it is, and then give you no phase-in time to put something into practice. End of rant. Thank you.
All right. Hello, my name is Amanda. I am a history instructor at a couple different community colleges. And I'm often confronted with history, right, when we talk about these things. In particular, when looking at education and the education system, this is actually a two-part question, so bear with me. Eisenhower talked about how the goal of the education system was not for an educated class of people, but an educated class of workers. And I think that's really important as we see these rollbacks in education, because it's almost like our education system was too good for the overreaching system of the powers that be that want to keep people in their, subjected classes, basically. And then as a second part, when you talk about affirmative action, so few people talk about the Humphreys bill, which was actually the other bill proposed at the time that would have done so much more for minority populations than affirmative action ever did, because it was basically set up to fail. But then when you're working with students, how do you get them, number one, comfortable within the discomfort, right, of having these conversations and looking at these things? And then also, looking at the materials that are available. Textbooks, especially for history, are terrible about representation of minority populations. I have a current text for U.S. history that the African American blurb in 3 of the 16 chapters is on Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we can, it's written by a white woman, right? So, How is that the chosen, Black history of the chapter? How do you, face those adversities?
I'll take the first part. I think we have to have an honest conversation about the dismantling of education as a public good, which is part of the overall process that's actually occurring. And I'll tie into Dr. Rice's point. My personal belief is the well-resourced, well-oiled machine that's doing this is making sure we remain a limited educated populace. So what will happen is, if I can boogeyman DEI, I can jam that into education, I can take over control of public education and privatize it like I did prisons. So the goal is to keep, there's this whole conversation, this is where, this is the Trent comment. The point is, we're talking about, is higher education worth it? And the colleague I laugh about that all the time, because everybody who's asking that question is sending their kid to college. So who are we talking about? I become uncomfortable with all this workforce development conversation, because that's to create workers that you can exploit. So you have to be very careful about that, the use of it. The underlying issue that Dr. Rice talks about is its resources. Well, we know how our schools are resourced by tax dollars and property tax. This is a design, people. This is a design to make sure I keep just enough folks uneducated to support me instilling fear into them of the other. So that's only part one of the question. I'm gonna let somebody slide on 2 or 3 or 4.
I would be glad to engage the second part. I think it's super important in terms of instructor choice, right? It's the same conversation when I talk to colleagues in areas of STEM that says, how can I put DEI in there? Like, numbers are numbers, blah, 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 you've heard it all. And so the question becomes, well, in the textbooks of choice, are they textbooks that are written by women that you're sharing with your students? Are they international scholars, or are they all domestic? And that addresses biology, chemistry. We can go on down that path. Where I'm going with this is, you see it, so it's a tremendous opportunity for you to address it. But even more powerful is that you're present. So making sure that you remain present to cultivate those conversations of importance about the history. Yes, there are textbooks, but we know there's tons of literature out there that can support not necessarily the course instruction, but that complement your teaching style, because that's how I'm going to learn in your class. So the info share that you give me, making certain that it's going to empower me where I stand and meet me where I am. And so taking hold of that power of instruction is so important. And so I think it's a powerful question, but what I would do is kind of impart that question back upon you as the leader of that space, and making certain that it is inclusive of that thought life, because that's what you're cultivating, so that ultimately your students can have inquiry to move on with that knowledge that is so important.
I want to your comment here, sir. You resonated very loudly with those online. That part, hear, yes, yes. I detected no lies in that statement. So thank you. There is one final question here, however, and I have lost it, but it was something to the effect of, do you all see any possibility of suits coming forth in response to the affirmative action Supreme Court ruling that questions Title IX in a similar position? So it's to say that if you could say no for race, how can you then say yes for sex, gender?
Well, I think that the questioner has a good point, and the Equal Protection Clause has been interpreted to protect on the basis, different treatment on the basis of gender, or prohibited in some situations where the government is doling out benefits or treatment in a disparate way on account of gender. So I do think that there is risk of that happening. I think it calls to mind sort of a blend of both topics people should be watching, if you're not, the Fearless Fund litigation that arose out of Atlanta with, I believe, the first VC fund owned by women of color, exclusively investing in businesses owned by women of color, and is being sued by the same activist groups that were backing the SFFA decision. It's pending in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals right now, which has to date entered an injunction that prevented this private fund from closing its application process to hand out awards, grants essentially, to businesses owned by women of color. And that sort of touches on the blend of both topics, gender and race. I think, and many do think, that case will end up in the Supreme Court, so we shall see.
Thank you. You know, I think you talked about, Trent, the idea of differences between allies and partnerships. And I think that's one of those great opportunities for partnership in terms of, you know, affirmative action is clearly that for black folks, right? When we start talking about Title IX, there's a lot of white women involved in those discussions. And so how might we be able to find partnerships to raise these arguments in these conversations so that we are looking out for the best interest of all people and not just our own? I'd like to say, extend many thanks to this guest and our panel here. I have certainly been inspired by your steadfastness and commitment to this work, particularly in this new daunting landscape in which we're facing now. And now we're going to shift gears a little bit to celebration. And so I'd like to give a round of applause to this group.